My brothers and sisters, Colossians 2, 8 through 10 gives another general definition of Gnosticism, as well as how to combat it. Paul is writing about a philosophy like Stoicism, not a specific religion, such as Judaism. This is important to recognize, since in verse 16, Paul mentions the Sabbath and holy days, and it is commonly assumed that Paul condemns their observance. Yet, he does not. He warns against a philosophy that disparaged the feasting and joyous observance of the Sabbath and holy days. This is why Paul tells the Colossians to let no one judge you with regard to eating, drinking, or observing the weekly and annual Sabbaths, rather than what is commonly read into Colossians 2:16. There is no reason to keep the Sabbath or holy days. Believers in Colossus were being pressured by the ascetic society around them, which would have looked down on their feasting. This is confirmed in the rest of Colossians 2, which deals primarily with asceticism. Some branches of Gnosticism adhered to asceticism as a way to free the eternal spirit by living regimented, plain, and insular lives. Conversely, some Gnostics went to the other extreme, practicing hedonism, believing that what they did with their bodies did not make any difference since only spirit mattered. Paul says that this philosophy and its associated doctrines were plausible, but they were not based on solid arguments. He calls them vain deceit or empty deceit. They may sound good depending upon one's inclination, but they endanger the called out assembly. The apostle writes that they would be spoiled, which does not necessarily mean being corrupted, but rather of being plundered. Hence, the New King James Version's use of cheated. This empty philosophy would rob or cheat them of their faith, their hope, their understanding of Yahuwah, their relationship with Yahuwah, their vision, and the purpose that Yahuwah is working out. Once introduced, it would begin to steal away all of their true spiritual riches. Paul also provides two possible sources of this unsteady philosophy: the traditions of men and the rudiments of the world. Examining the rudiments of the world first will help to explain the traditions of men. Other translations call them the elements of the world, the basic principles of the world, or the powers of the world. In using this term, Paul is referring to the demonic powers that make this world, this cosmos, what it is. The source of this philosophy of salvation through special knowledge is Satan and the demons. This explains why, when we read the histories of various religions and their branches, the same patterns arise time and again. Man does not have it within himself to pass along accurately and dependably ideas that go back to the very beginning. With an incessant drumming, the powers of the world keep prompting men and women in the same vain deceits that directly contradict the truth about Yahuwah and his purpose for mankind. Humans certainly play a role in handing down these traditions. Sunday school teachers and theologians perpetuate the Gnostic myths of the immorality of the soul, of eternal consciousness, of progressive revelation, of each person having a spark of goodness within that just needs to be fanned into a flame, and of each soul or spirit existing before in heaven and returning there upon death. Men pass these traditions on to other men, but the powers of the spirit world keep these messengers on their track and blinded to the truth. The last phrase in Colossians 2:8, not according to Mashiach, is a simple one, but it encapsulates what this is all about. Not a single branch of Gnosticism had the truth about Yahushua HaMashiach. That knowledge can be found only in Yahuwah's word. Many of the people who had come into the Colossian church had brought their pagan philosophies with them, and they soon began to have an adverse influence on the entire congregation at Colossus. Paul corrects the people in the church who were doing this in Colossians 2:20 through 23. Apparently, some of the people had begun thinking that self-imposed asceticism could somehow contribute to their salvation, and had begun turning away from trusting in Mashiach. They had more faith in their unbelieving works. Paul warned them about this in Colossians 2:8. Beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Mashiach. How frequently the servants of Yahuwah have had to say this. John uses almost the same words at the beginning of 1 John 1. Look, our hands have handled him. We have looked at him with our eyes and heard him with our ears. Who is the we? He speaks of the apostles, intimating, get back to what we taught you. Jude and Peter say the same thing. These men were not confronting the same people, but they probably were confronting elements of the same philosophical system that affected the church so strongly, even as early as AD 50s and 60s. Human nature always has a strong drive to make the way of Yahuwah more attractive to the senses by blending it with traditions that are not part of Yahuwah's word. This is what is found in Exodus 32, which Yahuwah included in his word so that we would see it etched vividly. The Israelites tried to introduce the Egyptian religion they had just left into the way of Yahuwah. They used the bull to represent the nature of Yahuwah. No wonder Yahuwah was so upset. They were trying to syncretize paganism with the truth of Yahuwah. Just a few chapters after, he gave them the terms of the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant was signed, sealed, and delivered in Exodus 24, which was a very short time chronologically, and they were already trying to twist the nature of Yahuwah into something radically different. We see elements of this in the book of Colossians. The theological term for this is, as has been already mentioned, syncretism. It means a joining, a meshing, or a blending together, and alloying. Is anything purer than the word of Yahuwah? How could a person think to improve it by adding something foreign? The outstanding historical example of syncretism, at least in terms of what we call the Christian religion, is Catholicism. It is a universal religion precisely because it has absorbed traditions of worship from cultures all over the world. Its Protestant daughters, having come from the same system, have not rid themselves of most of the syncretic beliefs, having thrown off only the governance of the Pope and several of the more blatant pagan practices. Yahuwah has his traditions. On the one hand, Yahuwah is teaching us traditions through his word and the ministry, traditions to which he wants his family to conform. However, we have brought traditions with us from the world. Southern traditions, Northern traditions, Western traditions, Eastern traditions, Texas traditions, European traditions, Asian traditions, and so forth. These conflicting traditions set the stage for conflict. The traditions of Yahuwah and the traditions of the world we brought with us cannot, in many cases, coexist. When we add to this our desire to be free, it makes for a more interesting mess. Yahuwah has his traditions, and the major difference between divine and human traditions is that his are right and true, and they work. However, because conversion is a process, and we do not instantly and magically know all of Yahuwah's traditions, we bring our former traditions into the church with us. Thus, the church is set up for conflict. This is a major reason for the writing of the book of Ephesians. It shows that for there is to be unity, both Israelite and Gentile have to submit to Mashiach because both of their cultures and traditions are wrong. Before repentance, our love for Yahuwah was like what the uncalled in the world have for him to this day. We love a concept of Yahuwah given us by tradition. We even had some part in devising it because we really did not know him. If we acknowledge this reality, we will discover it was an idol. In principle, it was tantamount to bowing before a statue, as the ancient pagans did. Those in the world cannot enter his kingdom until they worship the true Elohim, which is why the second resurrection is necessary. It is also why Yahuwah says in such verses as Ezekiel 37:6, I will put sinews on you and bring flesh upon you, cover you with skin and put breath in you, and you shall live. Then you shall know that I am the master. The Elohim of the scriptures says in his word that not a single person has ever known him until he chose to reveal himself, because before this happens, no one knows what to look for in Yahuwah. Both testaments say, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks after Yah. Human nature likes to think of itself as possessing certain virtues, that we were generous, kind, good-tempered, sincere, etc., and that Yahuwah saw these in us and chose us for his side. How can this be in light of these scriptures? Who is telling the truth? Though some do have virtuous qualities, Yahuwah does not call such people because of them. Besides, these qualities fall far short of the image into which Yahuwah is shaping us. Some people like to say they have always believed Yahuwah, yet what they believed was an idol, a syncretistic Elohim devised by combining scriptural truth and paganism. If what they say were true, Acts 18:27 could not also be true. We believe because faith is Yahuwah's gift. We have what we have only because we are the objects of his choice. He chose the ones he did simply because he chose them. We can go no further. We have no claim to any praise in this regard. Instead, it should humble us, stun us into overflowing praise, gratitude, obedience, and zeal that he has given so much to those so undeserving to receive it. Humility begins when we properly recognize who and what we are in relation to the sovereign creator and to fellow man, called and uncalled alike. We show humility by the choices we make, and these will largely be determined by our willing recognition of the immense value of Yahuwah's loving revelation of himself to us. 1 John 2:15 through 17 warns us that there is a profound gulf between the Father and the world, and that a believer is faced with making a choice between them. Spiritually, morally, and ethically, following Mashiach does not allow for neutrality. Yahuwah is bringing us into a position where we recognize truth, admit it is true, and make it a part of our lives. We are learning a new way of life, so he does not want us to be ensnared by the attractiveness of many things that are in the world. We cannot presume that because something appears to be harmless, it would be fine to do just this one time. Therefore, we have to learn to resist the urge to think and conduct our lives as the world does. World in 1 John 2 is the Greek cosmos, and its basic meaning is an ordered system. Because of the disparity between Yahuwah and this world, it cannot possibly be the world for which Yahuwah gave his only begotten Son. The world he created, he called very good. Nor is he referring to mankind, also part of his creation. He loves people and desires to save them. Nevertheless, he does not like man's way of life. This ordered, human-centered system is anti-Yahuwah and anti-Mashiach, and Satan sits at its head. This system occupies his creation and consists of people that Yahuwah loves so much that he sent his Son to die for them. But he does not love the system. It produces people that need to be rescued, and it tends to make them worse and worse. When Yahuwah speaks of the world, he is identifying all of man's purposes, pursuits, pleasures, practices, and places where Yahuwah is not wanted. Much of this world is religious, cultured, refined, and intellectual, but it is still anti-Yahuwah and anti-Mashiach. Through his calling, Yahuwah puts us into a position where he forces us to choose between disparate ways of life, and both of them are realities. We must choose either the eternal and worthwhile or the temporal and vain. Yahuwah is not saying that this world is unpleasant, unattractive, or unappealing, but we have to choose between that reality and his. The sum of this passage is that this ordered system, anti-Yahuwah, yet appealing and attractive, has the power to seduce the believer, to ensnare him and turn him from Yahuwah. We have to be vigilantly on guard against it. Shalom.